Alrighty.
Yeah, everybody, thank you again for tuning in this evening and joining us in this panel. Thank you all. And before we start, I want to let everybody know that we will be discussing free, prior, and informed consent this evening. And again, consultation is not consent. And one more thing, before we get started, I would also like us to acknowledge that wherever you may be tuning in from within Turtle Island, that you are on native land. Thank you. And with that, I'd like to go ahead and introduce myself and our panelists. Yad Shea Talia Boyd and She, Torich Eatney and Shle, Toy Higlini Bashichin, Asche Edeshache, Do Trabahe de Chanella, Akut Aldenesja and Shle, Nana Georgia Asia Hawan. Greetings, relatives. I am from the Diné Nation, Torich Eatney, Bitterwater Clan, and I come from a strong line of matriarchs. Very honored to say that. And I am so appreciative for our panelists this evening, who I will introduce right now. I'd like to introduce Janene Yazzie, who is Diné. She serves as a program manager for sustainable community development with the International Indian Treaty Council and is a co-founder of the Six World Solutions. She has worked on climate change, water security, food security, broadband development, energy development, and nation building with Indigenous communities for the past 12 years. Welcome, Janene. Thank you for being here. Next, I would like to introduce June Lorenzo. June is from the Laguna Pueblo and Diné. She works with community organizations and Indigenous nonprofits to address uranium mining legacy issues and resistance to new mining, sacred landscapes protection, and reparation of cultural patrimony. She advocates in tribal and domestic courts, as well as before legislative and international human rights bodies. She holds a Ph.D. in Justice Studies from Arizona State University and a J.D. from Cornell University. Welcome, June. Thank you for being here. Next, I would like to introduce Mr. Brett Lee Shelton. Mr. Shelton is a member of the Oglala Sioux tribe and also has Itas, Pico, Lakota, and Cheyenne ancestors. I'm sorry, I did not pronounce that right. He is currently a staff attorney at Native American Rights Fund, where his work focuses on Indigenous peacemaking initiative, boarding schools, and sacred places. He received his law degree from Stanford University and a Master's of Arts from the University of Kansas. Thank you so much for being here, Mr. Shelton.
Thank you.
And again, this evening we will be discussing free, prior, and informed consent. This session is, we will focus on the framework and also how it is a standard for Indigenous communities to claim their rights to self-determination, consultation, and participation in decision-making. A component of the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, free, prior, and informed consent is an approach that encourages more meaningful consultation and is recognized internationally as a necessary component of land management and development decisions. Our panelists will explain the facets of free, prior, and informed consent and discuss successful implementation of this framework, as well as challenges to ensuring its intended outcomes. Respect for free, prior, and informed consent is an indicator for respect for Indigenous peoples' rights. Local communities must be adequately informed about projects in a timely manner and given the opportunity to reject or approve a project before operation begins. And I also want to provide a quote from the president of the National Congress of American Indians, Fawn Sharp. She states, "We need to understand some basic principles, our relationship. It's not with the Department of Interior or the Department of Health and Human Services. It's not with agencies. Our relationship is with the United States. Consultation from a tribal leader perspective through a sovereignty lens, it's a basic principle. And that is no other sovereign should be able to take unilateral action affecting our land, territories, resources, and people within our territorial jurisdiction without our consent. We are sitting at the table in a government-to-government relationship with political equality, and that is the challenge that we are facing." And that is a statement from, again, Fawn Sharp, president of the National Congress of American Indians. I really appreciated how she stated that for all of us. And so with that, I would like to jump us into our questions. And I'm going to ask June to kick us off with question number 1. to help us wrap our heads around the United Nations and the different mechanisms that exist within them. First question, what are the 3 Indigenous rights related mechanisms of the United Nations?
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for the invitation to participate. So I'm going to try not to be really long-winded, but they are important mechanisms. So I'll just give you a brief summary of them. And I also want to say that as a preface that these are not the only 3 places that Indigenous peoples can interface with the UN. They just happen to be mechanisms that were created with a large participation by Indigenous people. So most everyone knows about the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. It's housed under what's called ECOSOC, the UN Economic and Social Council. They meet in New York. They meet normally once a year. And it's a body of 16 experts. 8 are Indigenous and the other 8 are from state governments, although the state government ones can be Indigenous folks as well. There are 6 specific areas that they address. Economic and social development is the first, culture, the environment, education, health, and human rights. And so this, the creation of it really goes back to the 1993 Vienna Declaration, if folks are aware of that. And so it really, it was established by a ECOSOC resolution in 2000. And so it's probably the oldest. And they've done, if you go on their website, they've done a lot of reports, including on free, prior, and informed consent. So moving to the next mechanism, it's the newest, and it's known as the expert mechanism on the rights of Indigenous peoples. Before, let me see, how can I explain this? One of the most important bodies under the Human Rights Council was a forum, the Working Group on Indigenous Peoples. And when the Permanent Forum was created, Indigenous folks who know the UN system worried that they'd lose that body that was housed under the Human Rights Commission, now the Human Rights Council. And so there was a great effort to create this body under the Human Rights Council. And so that is now the EMRIP, what we call it. They meet once a year. It's a body of 7, can be Indigenous and non-Indigenous. And their mandate is more to really to do specific studies on certain areas regarding Indigenous peoples. And recently their mandate was really expanded so that they have a right in giving advices to state members, and they can visit state members and give suggestions on how to implement the UN Declaration. So I'm going to ask Talia, thank you. I was fortunate to author a report that was done after a meeting of members of all of these mechanisms a couple of years ago. And so the report that I've put up there has a lot more on each of the mechanisms, but it also contains statements by individuals who serve on all the mechanisms. And then thirdly, the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. As you all may know, the UN has special rapporteurs on many, many topics. And since 2001, there's been a special rapporteur on the rights of Indigenous peoples. As you know, the latest one was Vicky Tauli Corpus. And right now it's Francisco Cali from Guatemala, and we're very excited to have one from the Americas. And so, they focus specifically, they do country visits, they offer advice and recommendations only at the country's invitation. And they can, they're not, of course, they hear a lot of complaints and so on, but it's an independent expert. So as an independent expert, the person can hear human rights claims. And that's a really terribly fast description of the 3 mechanisms. I just want to mention one more. And experts who've been doing this for a long time talk about the voluntary fund as one of the mechanisms because it's been extremely important in getting Indigenous peoples to participate in UN mechanisms. So I'm just going to stop there because I don't want to take too much time.
Thanks so much, June. Yeah, that's a lot to flesh out and unpack all of those different mechanisms. So please take a look at June's document that we shared in the chat to look more into that. Thank you so much, June. Yes, absolutely. There's a lot of technical jargon in these spaces as well. So we'll do our best to unpack all of this in such a short amount of time. It's really condensing a lot of information. Thank you so much, June. Let's go ahead and move on to our next question. And this is another big question. I'm going to direct this one towards Janene. Janene, what is the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, UNDRIP? And is it legally binding? If not, what purpose does a non-binding declaration serve? Which countries voted against it, if any?
Okay, thank you so much for allowing me time today. And thank you, June, for that Herculean effort in summarizing such complex mechanisms. I'll try to follow your example. So the the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is a groundbreaking document that really was a culmination of over decades of work by international Indigenous rights advocates. And I hope that never gets forgotten as we think about it as like a UN instrument. This is the result of a lot of sacrifice and blood, sweat, and tears of just phenomenal Indigenous rights advocates working on the front lines of their communities and building solidarity across our regional experiences and our different experiences of colonization, and all of the challenges that our peoples face across the globe. And so it was a slow process, but it was finally, the document as we now know it was finally adopted by the General Assembly in September of 2007 by a majority of the 144 states that are members of the UN in favor, and only 4 states against. And this was Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and the United States at a time that the United States was under the Bush administration. And there was 11 abstentions, but we won't go into that. The UN Declaration was finally endorsed by the Obama administration in 2010. But despite there being recommendations from all of our allies and advocates and from Indigenous rights advocates here in the US that the endorsement be unqualified, meaning they endorsed the document as a whole, the US endorsement was qualified mainly because of a lot of the same issues that slowed the actual development of the declaration in the first place. And one of them was a huge concern about the ways that sovereignty when self-determination was being defined in the UN Declaration. And so the qualification made by the Obama administration was around ensuring that the UN Declaration's concept of self-determination would be limited by existing laws and policies, so by federal Indian law. So that basically that meant federally recognized tribes have inherent but limited powers of self-governance in the way that the United States endorsed this declaration. Regardless, the Declaration remains the most comprehensive international instrument on the rights of Indigenous peoples. It's a universal framework. And I think that's the beauty behind it, like that so many Indigenous peoples from so many different places were able to really co-develop this and create a universal framework for the minimum standards that are necessary for our survival as Indigenous peoples, our dignity, our well-being, and our future across our different communities across the globe. And so obviously some of the strongest points in the Declaration are around those points that were most contentious for a lot of the states, not just our self-determination, but the way we were asserting not spiritual, collective, cultural control control and over the management and development of our natural resources existing on our traditional lands. And so that's what sets this declaration apart. It builds upon like previous understood and adopted and ratified human rights standards, but it addresses both our individual and our unique cultural and spiritual rights as Indigenous peoples, as well as our collective rights, such as our cultural rights to our identity, our rights to education and health, employment, and governance. All of these things are extremely important. So it's not legally binding, but it is us as Indigenous peoples who have created it, who are giving it teeth now that it's in this stage of endorsement. And we need to continue to do that. We need to codify it. We need to use it in our campaign languages. And that's what we're seeing happening. I think for a while there was a disconnect over the importance of things that are happening in international spaces and what's actually happening at home. But it's up to us to bridge those disconnections and fill those gaps, because now I see so many Indigenous rights movements and campaigns and protection of our water and our lands, and to stop the criminalization of human rights and land rights defenders based on language that was created by that UN declaration. And like I said, it may be a UN instrument, but it's an instrument that was created by our own people. And as the Diné woman, one of the things I love to acknowledge and think about is that it's one of our matriarchs, Roberta Blackgoat, one of the resistors on Black Mesa, that was in those spaces fighting for the right to free, prior, and informed consent to ensure that no Indigenous peoples would ever again be forcefully removed from their homelands. And that's the power in these documents. And that's what our responsibility to carry on and to continue to implement so that it is enforceable. It does become legally binding. And it serves as the minimum standard, the foundation upon which we stand on and build our sovereignty.
Yes. Oh my God. Yes. That is right on. I mean, this is something that, again, Fawn Sharp also spoke on. You know, she talked about how we need to aggressively pursue that and bring it up on every consultation session that we have, right? And that there should be no unilateral action without our consent. So that's the bottom line, right? And like Janene said, we Indigenous peoples came up with this. So it's absolutely, we have to push it and we have to continue to push it. Thank you so much, Janene, for unpacking that for us. I'm getting tongue-tied here. Thank you. Let's go ahead and move on to a question that I have for Brett. And unfortunately, Brett has to jump off a little early today. So I'm going to give him 2 questions back to back, and that will give him some time to answer that before he gets off. So Mr. Shelton, I would like to ask you, what is self-determination and what role does free, prior, and informed consent play in exercising self-determination by tribes in the U.S.? Thank you.
All right. So self-determination is the idea that you have a right, and in this case, tribal nations have a right to do what they want, basically, to determine their own future. So it's closely tied to sovereignty, and in a legal context, there's a whole framework of laws that govern tribal self-determination according to United States laws, but I think the broader concept is more important, really, in this regard. And then free, prior, and informed consent is a vehicle, a concept by which self-determination is allowed to happen wherever it's applied. So if you're requiring free, prior, and informed consent, then you're allowing the people that are going to be impacted by a decision to say whether you want to do can go ahead or not, basically. So they're self-determining in that regard. They're complementary concepts that go hand in hand with each other that way. So FPIC, free, prior, and informed consent, enables self-determination in the context where it's applied.
Yes, thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
I gathered a lot of information off the National Congress of American Indians website, and so I want to share something that they also shared there. When implemented effectively, FPIC represents a critical tool in the realization of Indigenous self-determination, promoting community participation in decision-making, and mitigating the risk of social conflict around natural resource protection projects. Excuse me. So yes, thank you so much for explaining that. And then for this next question, and I hope we can unpack this a little more. What is the principle of free, prior, and informed consent, and how might it be used to protect the rights of Indigenous people? And is FPIC a right? Thank you.
All right. So I think that the modern roots of the idea of FPIC are in informed consent, which started out as individual consent in the international arena, which arose after basically the problems with Germany and research that they had done on concentration camp internees and other folks. And, you know, the idea, the world was aghast with that. And so they thought, well, people ought to have a say in what happens to them, right? And so that's where it started. But this has been advanced to peoples. Peoples ought to have a say in what's advanced to them. So this is basically a human right, and it's a human right held by groups or tribal nations in this respect. What's the rest of the question again?
Sure, I'll go ahead and repeat it. What is the principle of free, prior, and informed consent, and how might it be used to protect the rights of Indigenous peoples? And also, is free, prior, and informed consent a right?
Okay, and so basically the first part of the question is left. To really understand what free, prior, and informed consent is, it's important. Every word is important in that phrase, basically. It needs to be free, needs to be freely given, not coerced in any way, and that could include economic coercion, which is relevant when we have impoverished nations. It needs to be prior, means that you have to obtain consent before you actually start to do something. This is something that the United States has used as a weapon in the past, basically. Start to get something rolling, and a judge might be convinced that you're allowed to keep it going, even though it might have negative impacts, because it's already started. You already invested all of that. So it has to be prior consent. And then it has to be informed. You actually have to tell people everything about what you're going to do. So that they can make an informed, fully rational decision, not just get them to consent and then move on. So we saw, I think, a really good example of what's not informed consent was when they were doing genetic research on tribes in Arizona, and the tribes didn't consent to the full extent of the genetic research. I believe they only consented to diabetes type research. So, and yet the samples were used for many other things. And so that was not fully informed consent because they weren't fully informed about what was going to go on. Similarly, in a land use question, you don't want to, it's not informed consent if you don't tell all of what you're going to do. So if there's going to be mining operations, then you need to say everything about what's involved with that, including the processes and so on. And then finally, consent. Consent is not consultation. Like I heard you say towards the beginning of this, it sounds like you all have that as a buzzword, and that's really important. Consent is the ability to say yes or no, whereas consultation is basically an obligation to talk to somebody about something. So consent is what we're really after, because consent is the vehicle whereby which we can say no if we want. And that's how we actually self-determine in those areas, is the ability to say yes or no. And then we have an authority in the decision.
Wonderful, thank you. I do want to ask Janene or June if they'd like to add to that question. And I can go ahead and repeat it. I think the one I kind of want to push on a little more is how might it be used to protect the rights of Indigenous peoples? So perhaps we can flush that out a little bit more.
Can I show a slide? I sent you a couple of slides, and I just want to show just a little bit of language from the UN Declaration that mentions free, prior, and informed consent. I sent you the slides. I can screen share if you want me, if that's easier, or would you like to?
Yeah, let's go ahead and screen share.
Okay.
Otherwise I'd have to dig in my emails and
I will do my best to see if I
Okay.
know what I'm doing.
just real quick, our tech support, are we able to give June access to screen share? So go ahead and try it in June and let's see if it goes through.
Okay, so.
Okay, I just sent her the slides, so maybe she'll be able to pull.
Okay, it says it's opening. For some reason, the internet is really super slow where I am. So it's just the first slide, and it says opening, but it's taking awfully long.
Oh dear. Okay.
Sorry about that.
No worries. And I think that's one of the things we troubleshoot in Indian country.
Yeah.
He's dealing with slow internet, so
that hasn't been a problem before. That's the curious thing. So she got it? Oh, great.
Yay.
Okay. So thank you very much. I want to just share the language that's used in a number of articles. So free, prior, and informed consent has been used in the context of no forced removal from lands or territories, which would be directly relevant to the situation that Janene recognized. Article 19, before adopting or implementing legislative or administrative matters. Of course, you know, in the advocacy that I do, we tend to talk more about like extraction, but it's pretty broad. And then Article 28, a right to redress for lands, territories, or resources that have been taken without free, prior, and informed consent. And then one that's particularly relevant to the work I do, no storage or disposal of hazardous materials. Oh, a little chat thing is in the way and I can't. Without free, prior, and informed consent. And then of course, Article 32, which is free, prior, and informed consent before approval of any project affecting lands, territories, and resources. So those are a number of contexts in which it appears. And can you just flip to the next slide? Okay, so I just want to say a quick word. In 2014, as you know, one of the ways in which we've worked to implement free, prior, and informed consent is to apply it to real cases. And one of the mechanisms, for the United States, one of the few human rights treaties that it signed is the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights. And so every 4 years, the United States has to provide a report to the HRC saying how they've complied. And civil society and indigenous peoples will say, wait a minute, they've fallen short in these ways. And then after hearing everyone, they issue what are called concluding recommendations. And this was issued in 2014. And if you can see what they said, the state party is the United States. And they said that they should, of course, adopt measures to protect sacred areas, ensure that consultations are held and in communities that might be adversely affected. And then the language is important with a view to obtaining their free, prior, and informed consent for proposed project activities. When they use that, this was very exciting for many of us to have them use this standard, And so I want to just connect a few dots. Janene described the UN Declaration. And by the way, the American Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is just as important. It applies to the Americas. It was adopted in 2016, and I'll say a few more words later. But so what human rights organizations have said is, okay, in complying with treaties that the United States and other nations have signed, we would like for them to use the standards in the UN Declaration to implement these human rights. So as regarding indigenous peoples, use the standards in the UN Declaration, in the American Declaration to implement. In this case, it would be Article 27. Oops, okay. Go ahead and move to the next slide. Okay, so this is what the Human Rights Council said. Okay, now the monitoring body that monitors the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, also known as CERD, offered these concluding observations in a similar context where reports have been submitted. They have the general recommendation number 23 that was issued in 97 on Indigenous people specifically, but they say that, that the United States should guarantee in law and in practice the right of Indigenous peoples to effective participation in public life and decisions that affect them based on their free, prior, and informed consent. So this is one way. I mean, the United States keeps saying things like, oh, you know, it's what's the word that they use? I can't even think of that word right now, but you know, they refer to it as soft law. Unfortunately, one of Biden's administration statements has done that recently, and we're hoping to change that. But so the way that it's enforceable is as a standard when enforcing existing treaties that the United States has signed, and these treaty bodies have already told the United States to do that. So just want to insert those thoughts. See if Janene has something to add. You can take away the slides. Thank you.
Yeah, I definitely would like to add on to that, particularly from the perspective of how we use these standards, particularly free, prior, and informed consent and community organizing. One, I think it's just a phenomenal tool to reframe for our own Indigenous peoples our rights that need to be met and upheld when we're engaging with systems of power, structures of power, and decision makers that hold a lot of power, because that is the core of the inequality that exists in our lands. And this standard and all of the other rights that are outlined in the UN Declaration, and I'm glad June brought up the American Declaration as well, because that one's even slightly stronger, I would argue. But like all of the rights that are outlined in these things come from real experiences that we have in being marginalized, are rendered invisible, are outright rendered powerless and voiceless in the mechanisms that have exploited our lands, our territories, our people, and our sacred sites. And so when we're talking about what this standard means and what it looks like, I think that the UN Declaration and the articulation of it is a starting point. It's a starting point for us to further define for ourselves as individual Indigenous peoples, not assuming that what free, prior, and informed consent protocols work for one tribe will work for another. And I think this is where it comes in conflict with federal requirements and with even state law, state requirements. I saw a question earlier in the chat that I'm going to try to answer, weaving into this. And so like the US, the federal government on the federal level has its own standards for consultation with Indigenous peoples. And this often is described around the concept of nation-to-nation relations. And so there's two things that does. It limits nation-to-nation relations and those types of privileges to federally recognized tribes. And we know we have so many communities and so many peoples that lost their federal recognition through displacement, through genocide, through cultural erasure, through complete colonization of their homelands to create metropolises like Los Angeles and San Francisco and Tucson, lost their status because the realities that their homelands cross international boundaries on the Canada-US border and on the Mexico-US border. And so that's the first problem with upholding that standard, are confining how we define free, prior, and informed consent to federal recognition. The other thing that it does is that it reinforces a body of law that has been built off of very unjust, unfair relationships with Indigenous peoples. One of the things with our treaties to recognize is that those treaties were entered under duress and many times without full access to the full implication of the meanings of the words that were inherent in those treaties. And so one of our core parts of our struggles for modern treaty rights is to ensure that we're having the treaty upheld with the intent upon which it was entered by our people, meaning that we can assume that our people had a specific type of intention for themselves, for their future of our nations and the future of our peoples when they entered into those agreements. And we need to now translate those rights in light of that and not of the intention of the United States. And so when we're talking about free, prior, and informed consent and what that looks like to bring it to the people level, to the place of operation, Declaration, the power would come from that first by educating our people on it as a standard and as an indication of our inherent rights and the history of how we fought for that standard, but also to implement it across the board in all of our activities. If we're engaging in public consultation or public hearings about extractive industry leases on our territories, we go there demanding what type of free, prior, and informed consent standard we need upheld in order to have equal participation, just in participation in that process and in that decision making. We don't even have to do it on a legislative level. We can do it on a policy level. We can advocate with partners, with organizations. I know we're trying to do this with Parks Department. We're trying to do this with FEMA. We can advocate for on a policy level for that standard of free, prior, and informed consent to be further fleshed out and given more teeth and authority. And we have to do this even with our own tribes so that we uphold these standards for ourselves. And that's what true self-determination and exercising that means. And that's how we bring power to these standards that have been created for us.
Wow. Excellent. Excellent. Thank you so much, Janene. Yeah, that really helped me wrap my head around it as well. And thank you for addressing the chat question. It's a pretty hefty question. I want to go ahead and read it off just because it's a good one. Should the model of premise of FPEG extend to the state and federal relationship? That's question one. And then question two, given the UN context that was provided, can someone unpack the similarities and differences between US tribal relations / sovereignty on the one hand and existing US territory freely associated states on the other, how consent factors in and legal and cultural implications? So I think Janene did a great job of unpacking that for us. You know, the fact that we as tribes need to step up and do that work as well, and not rely so much on the federal agencies or the government to do that work. It really falls back on us as Indigenous peoples. And being that we were the ones who put these ideas forward and want them implemented, it's all the more importance for us to continue to do that work. And absolutely educating our communities on these mechanisms is critical. You know, this is how we put boots on the ground. This is how we keep our younger people in the work, you know, to really wrap their head around the political landscape. There's so many nuances that exist, and it's a lot to really try to comprehend. So it's a little intimidating, free, prior, and informed consent, and just talking on an international level about all of this. But this is what it takes for Indigenous peoples to defend our sacred spaces and our lifeways and our identities as peoples. So thank you all for sharing that so much. And I, again, want to express deep gratitude for Mr. Brett Shelton. He has to excuse himself shortly. So I just want to recognize the work that he's put in here today with us. And thank you for sharing time and space with us, Mr. Shelton. And we do have a few more questions. This question here.
Sorry, Talia, can I just add to address the question that was asked in the chat already? Just add a little bit that I think is important, because there's this question about the differences between U.S. tribal relationships and sovereignty on the one hand and existing U.S. territories and freely associated states. And like, couple of places that come into mind are Guam and Puerto Rico. And both places have Indigenous peoples, right? But I think they face even more challenges because as occupied territories of the United States, and that are not quite recognized, that are not recognized as states, federal Indian law doesn't even apply to those populations. And so that's where the Universal Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples has been very helpful and sort of kind of creating and equalizing the playing field despite the realities of whether you're recognized or not, or how the colonial structures of power impact and affect your rights. We all have like a common ground to stand on when it comes to the UN Declaration. And the reason why I was emphasizing how the importance of us as Indigenous peoples, as Indigenous organizations, and as allies to Indigenous peoples, our partners to Indigenous peoples, the importance of us implementing those standards is because there's so much discrepancy among federal law, state law, county law, that is by design, that is meant to create bureaucratic barriers and political conflicts around jurisdictional authority. And we need to combat that by creating our own consistency at all of those levels. Here in the state of New Mexico, I know how that manifested in the Energy Transition Act was that when we were pushing for the UN Declaration standards and the rights of Indigenous peoples to be upheld in the development of that act, because we're on the front lines of these communities impacted by the closure of these generating stations and dealing with the legacy of contamination of extractive industries in our homelands, the state tried to fall back on the fact that they already have their own state level standards for consultation, and that was slightly better than the federal level, so they were going to go with their own. And in all these cases, it needs to be unacceptable. Those types of compromises are not acceptable. The declaration is the minimum standard. Everything else is far off what we want and what we need for our future.
Yes, thank you, Janene. That is awesome. Thank you so much.
So I want to add something, which it's between the lines, but it bears repeating. And the human rights bodies that I mentioned earlier, at least one of them has said, because a lot of people tend to see it as like state to state, and they think it just concerns the federal government. And so in one of these bodies during this process, they made very clear, because of your form of government, United States, these standards should be applied at all levels of government. So not just the federal level, the state level, the county level, the city level. So I just want to stress that. Sometimes people think it only applies at the federal level.
Great point, June. Yeah, absolutely. And again, this is why it's important for us to educate our communities, right? Because when we talk about FPIC, it seems like a really big international word and kind of scary. So a lot of folks tend to write it off, thinking that it's not, not to be used within a local, in a local way, which is totally not true. You know, we can utilize it in many levels. So thank you for sharing that. Let's go ahead and move on to our next question. So this is, again, well, I think we kind of covered that. How can tribes implement FPIC? What is the FPIC process? Are there examples of successful implementation of this framework, as well as challenges to ensuring its intended outcomes? And so when we talk about this, I think it's important to kind of break it down even a little bit further as to who are the Indigenous authorities to give consent, right? What is the meaning of prior? And I think Brett touched on that a little bit earlier. What role does time play? What is the form consent can take? And then what recourse mechanisms are available? And can Indigenous people say no? Right. So these are all questions that kind of stem out of this bigger question of how tribes can implement FPIC and what that process is. And so I'm hoping we can flesh that out a little bit more.
There goes my dog.
Yeah. So
so I'll try to jump in here because I have an idea of how to answer some parts of the question, but not all of them. But starting with the question around who is the Indigenous authority to give consent. This is why I think the UN Declaration is so beautiful, and why I encourage people to sit down, read it, process it, But part of what we're saying is not only do we have these inherent and collective rights as Indigenous peoples, but a part of that is the right to create our own mechanisms of governance. And this is an important thing for all of us to confront, particularly if we're from federally recognized Indigenous nations, because that federal recognition came with certain caveats, right? We had to perform in a certain way. We had to build governance in a certain way in order to be seen as and deemed as legitimate operating governments. And that means a lot of us are operating with tribal councils and tribal governments that don't reflect our actual traditional governance structures. And so with the UN Declaration, not only saying we have all these rights that are very, could be used as very informative and strong protections against ongoing exploitation of our lands, our peoples, our territories, and our resources. But it also says we have these rights that are more reflective of our responsibility as Indigenous nations to create governments and decision-making processes that actually reflect who we are as Indigenous peoples. And I think that comes with the responsibility to confront the influence of colonization in our lands and in our territories and in our tribal governments. And so it opens that door almost for like being protected by this minimum standard, but also having the space and the ability and the articulated rights to be able to rethink and reform our own types of traditional governments and decision-making processes. And so that becomes really important when we're exercising and implementing this in our own homelands and codifying it through our own authorities. And then also then defining, what does this mean? Like the form of consent, because we use it in all aspects of our community organizing work, it takes many different forms. In research, for example, free, prior, and informed consent may mean agreeing and co-creating the purpose of the research with the actual stakeholders, the people who are impacted by it. So we're no longer allowing a process where research is done by experts who come into our communities and they publish these beautiful papers and they win the notoriety and they become an expert on our peoples and our conditions, and then we never hear from them again. And those findings are never translated into solutions. And so changing and challenging that using a free, prior, and informed consent standards means setting for ourselves expectations of researchers, setting for ourselves expectations of what we want the benefits to be and how we want them to be delivered, all prior to providing our consent. And our consent can be defined as stakeholders, as interest groups, as tribal governments, as cultural knowledge holders, as Indigenous women. It can be defined in a variety of ways if you're looking, but it has to be specific to the context and the place that this agreement is being carried out. And I think that allows for both the beautiful diversity of our cultures and our beliefs and our worldviews and our challenges, but also the diversity of our solutions that we need and that our world desperately needs to deal with the impacts of climate change, with the endemic environmental contamination and the unsustainability of our economic system right now. And so that's where I find all of it kind of weaves together.
Thank you, Janene. That was great. Well, we have a lot of questions rolling in now, so I don't know if we want to try. Go ahead, Jen.
Yeah, sorry that we didn't get to say goodbye to Brett. I was hoping that we'd give him a little chance, but I think he's jumped off already. I just try not to jump in. So anyway, I do want to say that if you, first of all, I know that all the special rapporteur has done a report on free, prior, and informed consent, as have the permanent forum and MRIP. And so it's being applied in more and more contexts. And I just want to say, when you say, well, is there a process? Well, as Janene just suggested, because of the diversity of our situations and internationally our status, because this applies to Indigenous peoples, whether they're federally recognized or not, there is no one process, but I think it's the substance that's important. The substance of every single one of those elements, the free, the prior, the informed, and the consent. And, for some cases, consent does happen. I mean, some Indigenous peoples do freely decide that they want extraction or they want something to happen. And then that's part of sovereignty. I remember when the Special Rapporteur, Jim Anaya, was doing a report on extractives, Indigenous peoples and extractives. I certainly, with the organization I was with, I think it was Indigenous World Association at that time, although I do work with the Treaty Council too, but also really pushed for inserting language that it also means the right to say no, because, mining companies, they want to talk about free, prior, and informed consent, but they always sort of assume they're going to get consent at the end of the day. And it was important that he put in his report that, that Indigenous peoples have the right to say no, and that right should be respected. And I find more and more that that's something, again, that we need to stress again. There's a big push in the area of extractives to really reinforce Indigenous people's right to say no. In the context of intellectual property, it's not just about land. This whole new area, I'm involved in negotiating an instrument to protect intellectual property of Indigenous people. So Brett mentioned genetic resources with the DNA of folks, but there's Indigenous knowledge, which Janene mentioned earlier, and in the area of medicines, plants, seeds, this whole area, Indigenous peoples are really having to. They're in some areas of the world that are really are biodiverse. They're having to deal with everyone coming in wanting a piece of their resources and trying to take control of this. And so Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous artwork, so many things that have been created by Indigenous peoples and so all of those will involve considerations of free, prior, and informed consent as well. Things that belong to, Navajo Nation has been involved in some litigation over intellectual property with a company. So this is a whole new area. And if people understand the fundamental right to, the rights involved. I saw a question earlier, what about off what are known as tribal lands? Well, Article 25, 26, 27 of the UN Declaration includes not just land currently recognized as belonging to Indigenous peoples, but ancestral lands. And so it doesn't just include current lands, and that's really important. So in the Mount Taylor case that some people know, a good part of the land that we're concerned about is not, formally part of Laguna, Acoma, Hopi, Zuni, or Navajo Nation, but that's ancestral sacred land to all of us. And so we very much believe that that this is lands that to which we have a right to protect. Article 26, the first paragraph says, Indigenous peoples have the right to the lands, territories, and resources which they have traditionally owned, occupied, or otherwise used or acquired. So I want to be clear about that. I'm going to stop there.
Great. Thank you, ladies. Yeah, there's a few questions both in chat and the Q&A. So I'm trying to filter through some of these and see which ones we can get to. And I know you ladies are answering some of them as well as we're going. So I'm trying not to repeat the ones that have been answered already.
Can I try to tackle two, Talia?
Sure, go for it.
The one from Sarah about how can we work to transform government agencies at all levels to require education of Indigenous rights for all public land managers and the inclusion of Indigenous leaders when creating policies and management plans. Right now at this stage, we just do it. And it starts by educating ourselves and carrying that education into those spaces and in that engagement. There's so many resources now that have been created to help demystify and interpret the UN Declaration and how it can be applied applied in different ways. I know IITC, International Indian Treaty Council, has a breadth of resources that explain that. Other Indigenous-led organizations and entities have also produced their own reports and content on that. But really, like from a personal experience, what has been most effective is my own self-education and my advocacy whenever we're in these spaces with tribal decision makers or with federal representatives of whatever department they're in, and giving them a copy of the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and demystifying it in the context of the conversation. So like telling them when we want free, prior, and informed consent standards to be discussed, telling them when we want our customary use of certain land areas upheld and centered in the development of management plans. And so that takes me to like the next question about from Maryland. What about the co-management and transitioning management of lands right now under federal ownership to tribes to manage like national parks and refugees, BLM? Will you discuss this in a future panel? There's so many connections with some of the other struggles for racial equity when it comes to what does it look like decentralizing authority and management of lands and resources, particularly around so-called public spaces. But for Indigenous peoples, that comes with a contentious history, right? Because those public spaces are often centered on our sacred lands, on our customary use lands, on our traditional hunting grounds, on areas that we are in relationship with and have always been in relationship with. And so there have been some very successful projects that have created different models for what does it look like when federal agencies or state agencies enter into really good co-management plans with Indigenous peoples. But there's also a lot of failures in what that looks like. And I think that one of the indicators for success is when the engagement of the Indigenous peoples is done on their own terms, and not when it becomes like a secondary consideration. So like when Indigenous peoples are able to self-organize their own stakeholders and rights holders to engage in those conversations from the beginning about the development of co-management plans, that's when it's most successful. Not when there's already a plan in place and then they decide to like add Indigenous peoples in to get their input and see what they like about their input or not, and then approve it and then say like, oh, you helped us develop this. That's not the same thing. And so I think it's up to us. Like, unfortunately, the burden of proof and the burden of responsibility is up to us as Indigenous peoples to learn from these models and to replicate it and run with it as much as we can in our local work with our communities.
Yes, and I think that's a message that we've been hearing over and over again throughout these teaching series, is that it goes back to the people. It goes back to the power of the people, and building that people power in that grassroots organizing, and really taking back our power as Indigenous peoples and educating ourselves in these foreign concepts and mechanisms forced upon us by, these foreign governments and our own government. So yeah, it's absolutely critical and pivotal that we continue these conversations and that we really step into these spaces and make those demands. Thank you so much, Janene, for tackling those questions. These are really these are hard questions. It's a lot to unpack. And so, and it takes time to really let it, sink in and wrap your head around. I'm trying to see if there's another one that we can get to here.
While you're doing that, I want to say something a little controversial, and it's something that I know the Treaty Council and others have begun to articulate a position on. And Janene described, I was fortunate to participate for a couple of decades at least in the UN and the OAS declaration negotiations. So I have some sense of a lot of the arguments that were made over the years. And, this concept of free, prior, and informed, there were many parties who wanted the word consultation in there. I mean, there was a hard fought battle over using consent, and all of these things. So many Indigenous folks, as Brett has said, as Janene has said, this is so tied to the right to self-determination. And Article 3 of the UN Declaration sets out in clear language what self-determination means. And it's also taken from, major human rights conventions that already exist. So if it's so tied to self-determination for Indigenous peoples, I mean, this is critical because other non-Indigenous organizations, communities, and so on, and I'm not talking about Indigenous peoples that are not recognized as Indigenous peoples, I'm talking about other organizations and so on, they're starting to use free, prior, and informed consent without any connection to the concept of self-determination and the whole concept of Indigenous peoples. And that's becoming a concern to Indigenous peoples worldwide, that they're trying in negotiating some international treaties and so on, that they're trying to just, take that concept of free, prior, and informed consent and then apply it to non-Indigenous peoples as well. So that's a bit of a concern because, and part of the answer is that they can't claim the same type of self-determination that Indigenous peoples have. They can't claim the same status. They can't claim the same kind of representation that they have and so on. And that's becoming more of an issue. And it is a bit controversial, but I do want to raise that as an issue.
Great, thank you so much. I'm going to try to. Go ahead, Janene.
Can I just quickly add on that?
Sure.
I think that's why it's so important for our allies and partners to not interchange terms like Indigenous peoples with Indigenous communities, with Indigenous stakeholders, with Indigenous women even. I know it's a lot of times it's out of good intention, but it actually erases the decades of work that was implemented or carried out in order to get us that recognition as peoples. And it's one of the things that needs to be upheld and respected in all language of all of our campaigns and what we're doing.
And while we're at it, when I did my, when I write, it makes me crazy when I see the word Indigenous with a little I. I want to tell your audience, start using a capital I, please. Regardless of what people say about correct grammar, use a capital I.
Yes, yeah, that bothers me too. So thank you, June, for alerting everybody to that. Yeah, there's a lot of good questions. And Janene, you tackled a big chunk of them. Let's start from the top in the Q&A. Who enforces the UN Declaration? What police enforce these rulings?
Well, I hinted at that earlier. I just want to say there's no one body, right? I mean, who enforces? It really should be who implements, right? So, and what would be, so the UN monitoring bodies, the Human Rights Council, the CERD body, in urging state parties to use the UN Declaration and the American Declaration to implement the treaties, that's one form of enforcement. Someday, and I think this has happened in a few countries, someday their Supreme Courts will say that they're bound by the standards in the UN Declaration, and that's another form of enforcement. So there's some international law in that regard. The Inter-American Commission on Human Rights has started to do that in some cases. NDOM, the Eastern Navajo Diné against uranium mining, their case is going to go before the Inter-American Commission. Anxious to see what's going to happen from that. So, so it's not any one body that quote unquote enforces the UN Declaration. I think the key and the other thing that I think Indigenous advocates have been doing, I feel that we all feel that it's our responsibility, is to really mainstream the standards, to really mainstream the thinking. And so, I take it into the World Intellectual Property Organization and the negotiations. It's taken into the Convention on Biological Diversity. It's being taken into all these other fora where rights impacting Indigenous peoples are being considered.
Absolutely. I wanted to add on to that. I was first going to joke about the enforcement issue and then say like these guns,
Yes.
That's
Young
what enforces
guns.
these. But yeah, to build off what June is saying, which is like absolutely spot on. we need to look at the implementation. And one of the things I really want to hold up, because I know we have Indigenous relatives tuning into this, is that one of the things we have to confront as Indigenous peoples is that many of us don't have the word rights in our language. Like it's just not translatable. What we do have is a word for responsibilities.
Exactly.
And so when we look at it in that way, it's about us implementing and exercising our own responsibilities to each other, to ourselves, to our lands, to our peoples, and to the process and protocols that are in alignment with our worldviews and our values as Indigenous peoples. And so in terms of mainstreaming it, this is where I encourage people to go wild. Like, you know, I'll be in one-on-one conversations and tell people when they ask me if I want to do something like, I uphold the free, prior, and informed consent standard. Like, you need to give me more information before I can say that I'm going to do something or not. And I'm making light of it, but we really need to be that consistent in all of our work across the spectrums of work that we do, our boards that we engage in, our coalitions that we're a part of, our research institutions that we're members of. We need to make sure that we're carrying that message forward and upholding these rights as the minimum standard in whatever way is applicable to the work that we're doing. And that's how we really mainstream it. That's how we give it teeth. And that's how we use like every mechanism available to us to enforce it and create and redefine those standards. And I'll give you an example of how I've seen that work across a couple of different cases. When organizations themselves have policies to uphold the rights of Indigenous peoples and carry out a lawsuit, for example, against a corporation that is violating those rights, are using certain agreements and privileges to violate those rights, what may not be a law still gets referenced in the development of a case as part of a standard by which the resulting law gets developed. And we're seeing this happen prior to COVID, where the Indigenous Peoples Major Group was developing an international set of gold standards around the core rights of Indigenous peoples, but also connecting it to some of the other rights of marginalized and systemically oppressed peoples across the world, to create like generalized gold standards. And it got to the point where we're called upon to present to U.S. Congress because of a case against the World Wildlife Foundation, in which they were going to ask us to explain the development of the gold standard for rights-based approaches to conservation development. And that would have really helped us. It created an opportunity for us to define what these standards and what these rights meant, their origins and Indigenous peoples' rights, and also how we need to codify that to be more strongly implemented in U.S. foreign relations, but also domestically in U.S. policy. Unfortunately, it was right around the time when COVID hit and everything started to get shut down and travel was stopped. But it shows that there is opportunity and momentum that is created when we create our own standards in own ways and own mechanisms and agreements to enforce these rights ourselves and exercise them as responsibilities.
Great. Thank you, Janene. Thank you so much. Let's try to answer a couple more questions here. And they seem to be okay. Let's start from this top one. As a non-Indigenous advocate engaged in a current U.S. Forest Service forest plan revision who has received pushback from the Forest Heritage Officer, which policies/declarations give us the most power to hold the U.S. Forest Service accountable for consultation and/or consent? I believe only the former is required by the 2012 Forest Plan. Do any of you ladies want to tackle that one?
I'm trying to follow the question. Without context, it's a little difficult to know, like, do they have an environmental impact statement that they're considering, or, what's the context? And, so it's a little difficult to follow without knowing a little more context in that, because, with the Mount Taylor, there is still an environmental impact statement. It's been sitting for several years, and we're in that process. It's taken a long time. So it's a little difficult to follow the question. However, I would say that, it goes back to the point that the urging to honor free, prior, and informed consent when it comes to sacred areas applies at all levels of federal government. And, we would argue that it should even be incorporated in the EIS phases, in those standards, and similar standards for, looking at development in areas that concern sacred sites and tribal lands. So that's what I would say without having more specifics to that question.
Yeah, she did add, we expect the draft environmental impact statement this Friday, but to date, we have not seen any tribal consultation.
Wow.
Yeah. Excuse me. And that unfortunately is what is happening across the board, right? And which is why we talk about
I think that starts with a violation of federal law before
Yeah,
it actually
exactly.
right.
before UN declaration standards, but you could use both. And I think a lot of times, I mean, doing this work, one of the frustrating things is that you end up starting from scratch almost starting from scratch with each new administration. Appointees and leadership set the culture of what the federal agency is going to end up doing for the next 4 or 8 years, right? And every time we have, because of just like the travesty that is US education, we are constantly having to re-educate grown adults in positions of power about treaty obligations, about Indigenous people's presence, existence, and rights, let alone where we're located, right? And like our roles and our historical roles in the management of biological diversity and sacred places and in resources. So I think that's always the challenge that we're faced with. And so with that said, I think, again, I'm going to reiterate the way to mainstream it, the way to use this tool in all places is to first educate self about what those standards are, and then to use it in ways that are specific to the conversation and the context. Free, prior, and informed consent standard is a good one across the board. And I think that for anything to do with any federal agency, it's first recognizing and upholding that they have a federal responsibility for tribal consultation. But I think the way to give it meat and teeth is that part of that language needs to ensure that that consultation results in development of free, prior, and informed consent standards around the management of whatever resource that is being discussed. Because we have to create pathways for the diversity of the way tribes want to exercise that right. But it is the standard that can be started with.
Thank you, Janene. Thank you. Let's go ahead and try to get to this other one here. Let me type sorry. So this is another question. Is there something that the Line 3 water protectors should be doing that they are not? It seems the Biden administration is just going to ignore this protest and the alleged violations of treaty rights. What should they be doing? That's I don't know if we should answer that, and I don't think it's appropriate. We need to ask the Line 3 water protectors, and we aren't them. And so I'm gonna skip that question, and let's move on to this next one, unless I missed one in the chat. I'm kind of jumping back and forth. Excuse me.
Can I just use this as a teaching point as well?
Sure. Go ahead, Janene, and I'm going to jump off for just a few seconds.
Okay.
Agree with the decision to skip it and want to use the example of Standing Rock as a reason why. The reason why we're trying to hold and emphasize that it's up to each tribal nation or Indigenous peoples to define for themselves their pathway forward and the details around these standards and how they should be implemented and respected is because there's such a diversity of experiences and of goals and of visions. And so as being Diné Nation down here in Gallup, New Mexico, who hasn't been engaged in the Line 3 fight, just because we're Indigenous, just because we all agree that treaty rights need to be upheld and enforced, and just because we all are invested and committed to the protection of water as a sacred resource, as a sacred being, an entity important to the survival of our peoples, it doesn't mean we can define what that looks like for different treaty nations and different tribal nations. And it doesn't mean that even treaty nations that are in relationship with each other can define that for themselves just yet. There's so much unpacking that we're having to do in this moment in time, not only facing the challenges that we're sharing and different threats to our environment and to our remaining resources, but also unpacking the histories of historical trauma, of lateral violence, of politically motivated and manufactured conflicts between tribes. And that's a lot for different tribal nations to carry. And so for certain commentary on different tribal issues, it's best to refrain, because we're not, you know, like, we don't want to romanticize what it means to be Indigenous, and we don't want to perpetuate false narratives about expertise as Indigenous peoples to assume that we would know what's best for any one tribal nation. The point of the UN Declaration is that every tribal nation has the right to figure that out for themselves, and to create mechanisms of decision making and engagement and political advocacy that reflect what they want for themselves.
Yes.
Yeah, and you know, over the time, some, you know, people of perhaps my generation and younger, they use this language, and a lot, you know, it's new to a lot of folks, but when you get down to the basics about what it means about asserting nationhood, asserting rights, asserting responsibility to care for future generations and the lands that Creator gave us, the resources that Creator gave us, when you look at historical statements of Indigenous leaders, they were already saying that. They just use different language, and now it's, you know, international human rights language has been, you know, is used now, but fundamentally all of these things were being articulated historically by Indigenous leaders who saw them, you know, who saw very much that they were nations of people. And so, you know, one of the things that I've had to do, I mean, I'm trained as a lawyer, and if you study what used to, you know, federal Indian law, you know, the trust relationship, you know, it's like, you don't talk about self-determination, and the self-determination that many leaders think about is like, you know, public law 93-638, right? And so we mean something much bigger than that. And so even among our own communities, there is much education to do, and rethinking the language.
Yes, thank you, ladies. You know, this goes back to how, you know, we have over 575 tribes within Turtle Island, and how we all have our own unique languages and our own ways of knowing, right?
Yeah.
So again, I think we covered this in our previous teaching series last year, where we talked about how we can't, how you mentioned before, there's no one way of addressing this, right? Because we come from so many different ways of knowing, that we need to acknowledge that and make space for that. And that includes, on an international level, that includes free, prior, and informed consent as well. So thank you, ladies. There are several more questions I'm going to try to get to. There's one that just popped up. Let's see. In response to education of the bureaucracy. Now Deb Holland is in place as the DOI secretary. What are your top 3 asks? Concrete actions for agency/government actions that relate to tribal interests during her term. Again, you know, I think we can't speak for all natives. These are our own perspectives, and we're not speaking for any native nations. We can't do that. But I'm curious if you ladies have any ask for Secretary Deb Holland while she's there. But again, you know, as Native peoples, we don't speak for each other, and we have to make space for for each other to speak for ourselves. And so that goes back to reclaiming our own narratives and our own power as Indigenous people. And so that has to be respected and acknowledged. But yeah.
Okay, I can start.
Okay.
Now that we put out all those disclaimers.
Yeah. Okay, let's go.
This is not like representative of a people's or anything. This is definitely just like a personal observation and personal desire, building off of what's already been done. But I think, like, as an Indigenous woman, the power of having Deb Haaland appointed to that position cannot be undervalued, right? Like to be able to see an Indigenous woman at that level of authority and power and decision making is phenomenal. I think that one of the core things that could be happen is to create and open as many doorways as possible to the breadth of the talent that exists in Indian country in the United States. We have lawyers, we have policy experts, we have human rights experts, we have experts in international mechanisms, and I think opening the door as much as possible to drawing from that existing expertise is one of the most powerful things that could be done while she's in office, because she's not in there alone, you know. And I think that oftentimes that's what can happen in Washington, is that our leaders can be siloed and can be just put into such intense schedules and navigating so many different political agendas that they forget to draw upon the communities that are available for them, and the expertise that are available for them, and ensuring that it's Indigenous expertise is a step in the right direction. The other thing is building off of some of the initiatives that she's carrying out. So the investigation into boarding schools, I think to go in line with my first recommendation, working with the people who have been working on this issue long before she got into that office, and ensuring that their recommendations are upheld, ensuring that the investigation reflects the state and church structured approach to the assimilation and destruction of Native nations, so that we're not just like, oh, let's ask these schools for the data, but we're recognizing that this was an integrated assault, a structured assault on Indigenous peoples that included our healthcare systems, that included our state and federal governments, that included our educational systems and these religious institutions, and investigating it appropriately in that holistic manner. And then the third thing is to, as the Department of Interior, a lot of what falls under her authority is domestic policy, right? Like what's happening domestically. But I think it would be phenomenal if she could use that office to also influence and align domestic policy with foreign measures, foreign interventions, foreign policy, because we have the United States sometimes in some of these discussions upholding Indigenous rights and then turning around and not implementing it at home. And I think that pushing for alignment and ensuring that representatives who are representing our nation at the international level are also aware of Indigenous rights issues within our own country could help evolve the movement and the foundation upon which we advocate in these international mechanisms.
So picking up on that point, I know that during the last years of the UN declaration and also during the OAS declaration, the US government had like a team of folks to address Indigenous policy. And there was someone from Interior who would show up as part of the negotiating team for the United States. They had, when we addressed issues of health, they had someone from, Indian Health Service. So they tried to integrate departments that had, quote unquote responsibility for Indigenous people. So I'm hoping that continues even beyond the adoption of the UN declaration. I think it's important to do that. They already have a precedent for including that. I mean, when I go to the negotiation meetings in the World Intellectual Property Organization and we talk about Indigenous knowledge, the only people that show up from the United States are these patent and trade lawyers who often don't know very much about, Indigenous policy and so on. So I'd love to see someone from Interior there, because so much of what happens in that arena is under her responsibility. And then I just want to switch to another thing, which is, of course, I come from a uranium mining impacted community, and I pay a lot of attention in my advocacy to issues of extraction and protection of sacred landscapes. And one of the biggest pieces of law that stands in the way is the 1872 Mining Act. And I know about maybe 15 plus years ago, the Secretary of the Interior, whose name I'm forgetting right now, pledged that he was going to change that or amend it, because what it does, and the language right now in the environmental impact statement for a uranium mine that's been proposed near Mount Taylor, New Mexico, which I said it's a draft environmental impact statement, it still contains language that they are obliged to grant an extraction lease because of the 1872 Mining Act. And so that is something clearly that the Secretary of the Interior can do something about, can change policy, but it's, Indigenous peoples have lost so much. They've been so heavily impacted by this thinking that goes back to the Old West, the right to extract, and we have to move out of the way. I mean, it just horrendous thinking. And now we have more people talking about the doctrine of discovery and what it means for the country and articulating it. And more importantly, how do we deal with it? How do we first understand what it is and how it impacts so many aspects of our lives, but then what do we do about it? What, do we talk about restitution? What do we do about this? And I think that that her work, and I know it's not just one person, but the work in the Department of the Interior that concerns lands, most of which was Indigenous land, they can really change a narrative. They can change the language. They can change the policy focus. And we're not making this up. This is Indigenous land. So I think that that opportunity is there. So that's what I personally would hope for as part of the administration.
Beautiful. Well said, ladies. And with that, we need to start wrapping up. We have about a minute left. And so I want to thank you all for tuning in. Thank you to our wonderful, brilliant panelists for joining us this evening and sharing their knowledge and wisdom with us. Tremendous, tremendous work that you all are doing. Thank you for doing that and for bringing light to all of these issues that impact all of Indian country. There's a lot of work to do, and there's big shoes to fill still. So thank you, ladies, for the work that you do, and thank you to Brett. I'm sad that he wasn't here to help us close out, but I do want to close with a quote, and this is from Haunani K. Trass, who is a powerful matriarch who recently went home to the stars with the ancestors. And so I want to honor her and recognize her and with this quote. Our story remains unwritten. It rests within the culture, which is inseparable from the land. To know this is to know our history. To write this is to write of the land and the people who are born from her. That gave me goosebumps. But she was fierce, she was Indigenous, and she owned her power beautifully. And I hope that we can all do that, and that we can take that light that she shared with the world and keep it going, keep it burning. And thank you, ladies, for sharing your light with us here tonight. And with that, I would like to say good night and good evening to you all. We will be back next Wednesday, again from 6 to 7:30. And we will be welcoming my very dear friend, Amy Wan from Tohono O'odham. She will be talking about the militarization of the border. We also have Vanessa Noisy, who will be talking about Protect Oak Flat. And we have hopefully one more panelist who will be talking about the Arctic Refuge and the work that they're doing up there in Alaska. So thank you all so much. Again, we're going to have another really exciting panel next Wednesday. Please tune in. Thank you all for your support. Hagoanet, take care, and we'll see you next Wednesday. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. Take care, ladies.
Bye, everyone. Good night.
Good
Bye,
night.
everyone.